All right, so can all of you see my slides?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so so today I'll be talking about the idea of, whoops, let me see if I can enter full screen. Yeah, does that work? Okay, so today we're interested. One of the things that that I've gotten interested in, sort of somewhat more recently, is the question of whether animals can count, and how it is. What is the neural basis of our own numerical and quantitative thinking? And of course, we spend a lot of time wrestling with numbers. In the sciences. We don't seem to be very good at it, or it's something that we struggle with, and therefore we prize it as a sort of remarkable ability. Whereas in fact, we do all kinds of other very remarkable things all the time, but we seem not to kind of value them because they're things that our neural systems do relatively easily, and that all of us do fairly well. So, what is it? In theory, I could come up with a neural circuit consisting of just a few neurons that could count. Right? Neurons do computations which are which are a lot like counting, in order to execute more complex tasks. So when you're smiling at somebody, or when you're trying to infer what the expression on somebody's face means about their emotional state, these are all very complicated calculations, and those calculations are broken down into numbers that go up and down. For example, the membrane potential of a neuron is a number that goes up or down based on the inputs that it calculates from other neurons that are sending it their outputs. And neurons that fire, action potentials, which are, one thinks of that as the standard picture of a neuron. Action potentials are an example of a numerical counter of things that are happening in the world, a binary counter, in fact, because at a given moment of time, a cell is either firing or not firing. And yet, despite all of this computational potential, our brains seem to have difficulty, or we seem to have difficulty with just counting numbers themselves, right? It takes some time before a human being with billions of neurons, is developmentally at the stage where numbers seem to be processed. And so, of course, a lot of these are also dependent on how it is that we think numbers are being processed in our assays to try and get at what numerical cognition is. So part of the reason that I got to this point was because, for those of you interested in the insect communication system, is that insects interpret each other's, songs by analyzing patterns in the activity of sort of, so essentially hearing somebody when you're hearing me, and again you're effortlessly making sense of the words that I'm saying and interpreting meaning from them. But this is in fact a very complicated calculation, because if you think about it, all you're doing is you have a vibrating eardrum, and that eardrum is moving back and forth as I speak. A mechanical transducer sort of picks that, a mic, right, picks that up, converts it into electrical signals. The electrical signals through Wi-Fi reach your computers, then they get transmitted into the same kind of vibration of air that I'm producing here, and that then falls on your eardrums. And then essentially your neural systems just have two eardrums worth of vibrations, and that's it. That's all that it's getting. And this sense that I'm producing sort of something that lives as as information, that reaches your brain, it feels like it sort of has an ethereal, non-material quality, but in fact, it's just your brain listening to and making inferences from the vibration of a single eardrum. So we do complicated things in terms of picking up on patterns in acoustic space, and that's essentially what communication is. And then I got interested in the question of how these quantities, time, numbers, are themselves sort of processed in the brain. So, we have a sense of what the neural computation behind numerical cognition in apes and so on are, From fMRI data, we have a sense of where numerical cognition might happen in the human brain, but we don't have a good sense of how abstract numerical information is inferred from quantitative quantities of objects in the world. Right, so we need to find a good animal system for looking at numerical or quantitative ability, there are several animal models and several types of numerical cognition tasks that get assessed from those models. So what are some of these tasks? I'll give you an example of some of them, but essentially, what constitutes numerical cognition? What's an example of a behavioral task that you might use to assess whether numerical cognition has taken place? Well, there's the possible comparison of two numbers, right? This tends to be a difficult thing to do. So suppose you're assessing an animal's interest in two sets of food, right? 4 pieces of food versus 2. Part of the problem with assessing responses to such such a task is that you're not just giving an animal 2 of something versus 4 of something. You're also giving animals an overall larger amount of whatever you have 4 pieces of compared to whatever you have 2 pieces of, if the pieces are all equivalently sized. So one of the difficulties with numerical cognition is finding the appropriate controls by which to ensure that one's assessing numerical ability as distinct from one of the other physical attributes that numerical ability, that just the number, that quantity might co-vary with. So the difficulty then is one of exercising the right controls. Okay, so that's one way that you can do this test with those appropriate controls in place. Another task is that with monkeys and primates, there's been a lot of work on showing them sort of 2 objects. In this case, it would be 2 numerical sets of objects, and then seeing whether they can be trained through a reward mechanism to pick the quantity that is similar in. So you show them 2 objects, and then the task is to pick a third object which is similar. So this task can be done in non-numerical ways. So for example, you can show chimps literally an apple and an orange, and then later show them an orange, and then train them to either pick the same kind of object or select one lever if they think the object is the same as the one that was primed before or different. So that's one way that one can do this task. And in the context of numerical cognition, you may show the chimp, for example, 2 objects versus 4. The idea is for them to pick a third object which is similar to whatever they have chosen before, in quantity, but not in anything else, right? The actual object needs to be different, and the only thing that can be abstracted from it would be the same, would be the number. So for example, in this case, if you were to show chimps a choice between 2 apples and 4 apples, and they were to pick 4 apples, then the task would be, if you then show them if you train them on this and you then show them 2 oranges versus 4 oranges, would they still pick 4 oranges, right? And that's an example of controlling specifically for the type of object in this task. Okay, often the first thing that any of us learn in a school is just the association of numbers with symbols or language, right? And those symbols are called numbers, right? But 1, 2, and 3, these are arbitrary sounds and shapes which we in school or just in a given conventional language learn to associate with the abstract notion of quantity. So, there's some work on trying to see if dolphins can do this, birds can do this, primates can do this, and so on. Okay, there's another level of task which is perhaps more convincing with respect to a sense that the animal is actually doing a numerical task, and that is expectation violation, right? So, expectation violation is when an animal sort of you sort of show an animal that there are, say, for example, a dog, that there are 3 apples going into a bin, but then you remove the bin, and instead of 3 apples coming out, only 2 come out. This is an example of expectation violation, and the idea is that the animal is only going to be surprised by this change if they've been keeping track somehow of how many apples went in the bin. So dogs, at least people have thought or tried to use the kind of surprise face that dogs give you, the sort of what kind of look that they give you or just even the amount of time that they spend sort of staring at the experimental setup as an indicator that when the number of objects that go into, say, a hidden kind of box does not match the number of objects that come out, dogs do, the literature suggests that dogs spend longer looking at this. And furthermore, with sometimes a look of puzzlement, or what we interpret as puzzlement. And that's thought to be an example of such a task. Okay, and then there's some interesting sort of paradigms which I'll also share with you now on navigation, looking at whether the number of landmarks can be counted. And this work is done in bees and dogs. And then there are motor tasks, right? Pick the tray with n items. So training monkeys and so on to just pick a certain number. And it's in that context that number encoding, or at least proposed number encoding neurons have been identified in the monkey brain. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of a task which is not exactly numerical, but that's a nicely controlled task. And I hope that this video will play for you.
His star pupil is a 7-year-old chimpanzee. Show him the numbers 1 to 9, and he'll put them in the right order, pointing to them one by one. Every time he gets it right, he receives a treat, a tiny piece of apple or half a raisin. But now, the researchers make things difficult. As soon as the chimp presses the number 1, the rest of the numbers are hidden. He has to remember where the numbers were and press the white squares in numerical order. The positioning of the numbers is totally random. He gets it right, time.
Oops. Sorry about that.
His stop right, he receives a. As soon as the chimp presses the number 1, the rest of the numbers are hidden. Squares in numerical order. The positioning of the numbers is totally random. He gets it right, time after time, with lightning speed and 100% accuracy.
All right. So this is an example of a task that these chimps are able to do in some sense better than humans. Now, it's an example of a task that involves numbers, right? Now, arguably, this is a task that one could imagine happening in a non-numerical way, in that the chimp does not necessarily have to know that 1 represents the quantum, the abstract quantity 1, and 2 represents the abstract quantity 2 in order to do that task. But what the chimp needs to know is that the ordering of these, symbols must be in a certain sort of, the ordering must be sort of followed in a certain way in order for the reward to be received. And certainly chimps seem to be able to do that particular task, quite well. And of course, when the symbols get covered really, really quickly, they're able to outperform human beings on such a task, which is kind of cool, and suggests that their ability to remember kind of this briefly flashed visual scene outperforms that of humans. Of course, as I said, I don't know if you, the whole clip actually shows you what happens when you try and train humans on the same task. And this is also a nice setup because the chimps interact with the screen without any sort of intervening human beings, and they actually play in this sort of large arena outside. They just sort of wander around freely, and whenever they feel essentially like playing video games, they step in, and this is the work of Tetsuro Matsuzawa. So very, very nice work. So there are several examples of tasks like that do not sort of necessarily get at the numeracy of the symbols involved. But there's also, at the other end of things, there's also very exciting work with honeybees looking at numerical cognition. And this is exciting because, certainly these honeybees seem to be able to do tasks that human infants, at a certain age at least, can't. And this then involves number discrimination, and this work has sort of created a big flap. It's very exciting. Interested to see how it gets replicated and so on as well. But essentially, the idea is that honeybees sort of approach a platform, And when they approach the platform, they get to count. They get shown two sets of numerosities, and again you can kind of see that the experimentalists have to be careful to to make sure that that the size of these objects, of these two objects, covers about as much surface area as these four objects, right? So the four objects together are each smaller, so that the total surface area covered by all of these is the same. So controls for the amount of an object, even as the numeracy varies from display panel to display panel. And one finds that if the bees are systematically trained so there's a standard kind of landing platform, and then the lesser than option is displayed on one side and the more than option is displayed on the other side. And bees that are trained to move towards the larger number of options seem to be able to do this task, readily discriminating between 3 versus 4, and between every pair ranging from 1 to 7. So, and then famously also 0. So So if a bee is trained to move towards the panel with a smaller number of objects, then if they're shown, if they're sort of, without being trained on this, randomly shown blank sheets, they'll actually move to the blank sheets, suggesting that in any combination of objects between 0 and 7, 0 versus 1, 0 versus 3, which is what you see below over here, 3 versus 4, 5 versus 7, etc., that they're always able to do this task of flying to either the smaller number, if that's what they're trained on, or the larger number. And there's been a lot of work on bees of this kind. So, for example, to see whether they can generalize the rule. So if they're trained on 2 versus 3 and they're trained to move towards the larger set, you can then show them patterns where they now have to compare 3 versus 4 and see whether they've learned just to pick 3, which is the number that they were rewarded for earlier, or to generalize the learning rule and pick 4, which is now larger than 3, and vice versa. So this is interesting work that's been done with bees, suggesting that, in fact, even though there's a fair bit of variation across learning blocks, that whatever sort of paradigm they were trained on, they seem more likely to pick that. So, for example, 3 here is the rewarded stimulus, and they're able to, whether it's 2 versus 3 or 3 versus 4. If they're trained for 3, they're to sort of pick a card with 3 objects, then they're able to also do that. Okay, and there's a lot more material on bees that I might skip ahead on just because of lack of time. I'll just point out that therefore, if these bees are trained on, for example, 3 versus 2, right, and the experimenters have taken care to randomize everything, including the positions of these. So 3 on the left, 2 on the right versus 2 on the right, or the other way around, whichever pattern they're shown. So here they're trained to select 3 and then they pick 3. Here, if they're trained to select 2, even with the same ordering, they are more likely to pick 2. So whatever they are trained on, they seem to be good at picking out that same number of stimuli. Although you can start to see that as the comparisons move towards larger numbers and closer comparisons, so 4 versus 5, their abilities to discriminate reduce. So they're good with 2 versus 3. They're good with, regardless of what kind of object they're shown. They're good at 3 versus 4, but a little less so. And this is even when they're trained on one pattern but tested on another pattern, right? So they're able to ignore the pattern specificity of the stimuli. And but once they're dealing with sort of 4 versus 5 or 5 versus 6, their ability to discriminate seems to reduce. And there's other more classic sort of older work with bees suggesting that if bees are trained to find, so suppose there are 2 feeders, right? So a bee gets released and there are 3 landmarks and 2 feeders, that if they are trained on this kind of setup, then they're faced with a situation where there's an artificial change, right? So now this, at the same distance, one of these landmarks is moved here, such that even though the bee earlier flew 250 meters to get to the food. If the bees were using, the number of landmarks to count how far they've gone instead of a gauge of the amount of distance that they've flown, then you'd expect bees to pause here at F2, since it's whatever feeder arrives after 3 landmarks. And you find, in fact, that while most bees still travel 250 meters before they start feeding at whatever feeder they find there, a small number of bees actually follow the numerical cue and pause after 3 landmarks to eat at whatever feeder is found after those 3. This is old work in 1995. Okay, so this is the kind of sort of really cool work that's been done in the past, and we then got interested in zebrafish. The reason that we got interested in zebrafish is because since you can use calcium imaging to look at the whole zebrafish brain and get a sense of how cognition is done across a brain, and it's a powerful technique, the idea was to see if one could work on zebrafish when it came to some of these questions. Okay, so you can look at zebrafish and several other organisms, several other fish, some reptiles, several mammals, including rats and so on, seem to do quite well with comparisons of sort of and ratios of 1:2, 2:3, and so on, but get stuck with ratios higher than 3:4, right? So 4:5, etc. They're not very good at, just like the bees. And so essentially we get a sense of how, as numbers get larger and the distance between them gets smaller, with both of these attributes, the ability to discriminate numbers and quantities as of now, since we're still not sure in these cases when they're just trained to go towards a larger versus a smaller number, whether they are sort of abstracting numerical quantity. But we know that if it's a comparison of 3:4, so 8 objects versus 12 objects, most fish are able to do this, perform this discrimination. They're trained to go towards a larger task versus the smaller task, and later on they're able to generalize this to sort of 2 versus 4, but not to larger. If trained on 2 versus 4, for example, then or 8 versus 12, they're not able to generalize to larger comparisons of 25 dots versus 50 dots, right? That's just too much for even for the same ratio of 1:2. They're able to discriminate 2 dots versus 4. It's much harder to discriminate 25 versus 50. Okay, I'm going to skip over some other fish that seem to show similar abilities. So I'll just sort of end this introductory portion by telling you about a really cool experiment with rats. And the reason I want to introduce this to you is because this is a very interesting system that gives you a sense of why it is that such work might be, even at a behavioral level, valuable. This was an experiment done with rats in which they they were trained to press one lever for hearing if they heard 2 sounds, and to press another lever if they heard 8 tones. Right? And this was done in 2 ways. One where the tone size, the duration of the tone was varied from 2 to 8. And there was another set of experiments in which the total duration was kept constant, but the number of tones varied from 2 to 8. And regardless of what they were trained on, which paradigm they were trained on, if they were trained to press a left lever for a tone, so this is just 4 tones, but this lasts a total duration of 2 seconds, and that lasts a total duration of 8 seconds. When they heard the shorter tone, they pressed the left lever. When they learned to press the right lever when they heard 8. So the big question is, during testing, what happens when you play intermediate tones? Right? What does the rat think 3 tones is? Does it sound like a 2-second tone, or do 3 tones sound like 2 tones, or does it sound like 8 tones? And the interesting answer is that, unsurprisingly, when they heard the 3 tone, they were more likely to press the left lever than the right. When they heard 6 tones, they were more likely to press the right lever than the left. But when they heard 5 tones, which is the numerical intermediate between 2 and 8, right? 2 plus 3 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8. They were more likely to press the right handle than the left. And it's only when they heard 4 tones that they were just as likely, 50% likely, to press left as right. And this is a summary of those results, suggesting that when the halfway sort of point of this of this curve, was at 4, suggesting that essentially for these rats who are untrained in mathematics, we think, for the logarithmic intermediate between 2 and 8 was perceived as the midpoint between 2 and 8, rather than 5, the arithmetic intermediate. And that's interesting because it's a demonstration of Weber's law, which sort of proposes that a lot of our quantitative cognition, certainly with respect to sensory inputs like light and sound, are on a log scale rather than a linear scale. Any of you who've heard sound or who've dealt with sound know that decibels, which is the measure of loudness of sound, is a log scale. You know that light is also something that the just noticeable difference in light against background is a fixed fraction of that background, but a multiplicative fraction of that background, right? So that, and then also sort of interesting work suggesting that methamphetamines, which are known to speed up perception of time, also sort of shifts this curve a little bit to the left, sorry. Okay, what do we know about human beings? We know that there are differences between how human beings, which parts of the brain, under fMRI process math in sort of mathematicians versus non-mathematicians. And it's particularly interesting because mathematicians seem to, activate or sort of use parts of the brain that are also involved in spatial sort of analysis and various other things. Whereas for starters, for non-mathematicians, it looks like more sort of verbal areas of the brain sort of are involved. And there's also been interesting work looking at how math differences or differences in spatial rotation tasks across gender have been the field sort of really got revolutionized by looking at how training on things as simple as video games actually sort of led to massive improvements in spatial rotation tasks in IQ tests. So both for men and women, but sort of effectively closing to statistical insignificance the gap between men and women, suggesting that something as simple as video game playing and gender differences in access might have an effect on IQ tests. Okay, so these are some of the broader questions that we're looking at. Do features of neural hardware shape or constrain our performance in math? Why is it that math is so difficult? Does it represent an ecologically less useful task, etc.? And so I'm just going to skip ahead to sort of tell you what experiments we did. We were interested in looking at zebrafish and their choices between numbers of tasks, right? And so, we wanted to specifically ask whether fish could learn to count the number of objects. And to start doing that, we started to sort of, use the same tasks that people have done before, which is flash a certain number of objects on a screen. But now, instead of just training fish to go towards the larger number and be rewarded, we tried to see if we could train fish to do specific associations between the number they saw on the screen and the number of food flakes they would be given. Okay, so after a period of acclimatization where we just get fish used to a T-maze task by putting in 5 fish and then removing fish one by one so that the fish gradually learn to be alone, we eventually just put them in a simple T-maze. The fish moves to, is isolated first in the stem of the T. The gate is then lifted. When the gate is lifted, the screen in front of the fish shows one line on one side and 2 lines on the other side. And then the fish makes a choice. If the fish goes towards the sort of side of the screen with 2 lines, and of course, which side shows 1 versus 2 lines is randomized from trial to trial. But if the fish goes in this direction, then the fish gets 2 pieces of food. And here's an example of what these videos look like. There's our fish. And our fish comes here. The gate is raised. Now the fish comes in here, makes a choice, goes towards the left with some hesitation. And you can kind of see the fish pick up 1 and then 2 pieces of food before going back into the stem. Okay, so when we average across time, we get various responses, and some of the students in NISER have been working on kind of adding to the numbers on this, and we sort of see that fish eventually sort of sort of perform better than chance when it comes to choosing 2 versus 1 across trials. But we find a lot of inter-individual differences and a lot of side bias. So fish tend to go, if they've taken a left turn, they're highly likely to take a left turn again. Of course, that side bias tends to go down as trials continue, which is a useful sort of thing that we have found. Okay, so fish certainly got more accurate in choosing 2 versus 1 as training went on, but this doesn't establish whether fish count or not, and these could just involve a ratio comparison of the kind that a Grillo has already established. Okay, and there have been other studies that have also compared humans versus fish on reaction time, on the ways in which numerical ratio affects outcomes, and so on and so forth. Okay, and we have interest in sort of once fish are trained on this 2 versus 1 task to see how they would perform with novel stimuli such as 2 versus 3. Will they generalize the rule? Will they just go towards 2, which they've been rewarded for before, etc. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of skip ahead to the discussion of these results and then talk about new sort of paradigms that we're using in order to test numerical cognition. One of the sort of things is that we've started working not just with fish but with dogs on the same kind of task, right? And of course, now with the lockdown, most students aren't able to come into lab, which is actually, we've tried to turn this into an advantage by having students do these tests at home with their own dogs. But of course, the difficulty is in standardizing these. So we've been through a protocol, we've sort of developed a protocol which all students have to adhere to. They make video recordings of their dogs doing these tasks, and then the performance of the dog is assessed by another individual who has nothing to do with the dog or nothing to do with the tester. And the tester is not allowed to kind of interfere once the dog is doing the tasks, so that there is minimal scope for the observer expectancy effect and various other possible confounds of that kind. This is an example of one dog, Buddy, the experimenter here is Meher. And so over time, she found that even when, even with randomized placements of 2 versus 1, left and right, where in this case, the animal is just getting rewarded for picking the larger quantity, the dogs are able to do this task. And then that puts us in a position to ask other questions. We've also started a new line of work looking at neuroeconomic decision making. And that's kind of sort of taking the same stuff we've done before, except we extend this to not just look at questions around, around the quantity, sort of choices around numbers, but also we were interested in finding, an example of an ecologically useful task in which numerical choice might be exercised. And the literature suggests that fish show some preferences around shoal size, that is to say the number of fish around them that they shoal with. And we know that zebrafish are intensely social. In fact, one of the directions we started exploring in the lab is how much better they might respond to social rewards than food rewards. And so in this context, we did these assays where fish sort of swam around in these central tanks where they are disconnected from but able to view sort of shoalable sets of fish in other tanks. And as you can see, this fish is sort of frequently approaches this tank with 4 other fish in it. That tank has 2 fish in it. And this fish seems to clearly sort of prefer a larger shoal size over a smaller shoal size. But even though this is what the literature upholds, we have several fish that seem to prefer smaller shoal sizes. And so we're now sort of struggling to make sense of this. But fish certainly do, shoal and show sort of preferences, and the big question now is sort of how much these preferences kind of translate over time, and how consistent they are, how state dependent they are, and so on and so forth. And we're using some sort of machine learning tracking algorithms in order to sort of characterize the fish's trajectory in response to these various possible stimuli. Okay, so this is the kind of work that we do in the lab. I should also add that one of the things that I'm actually actively looking for, which I should, the place to probably talk about that is at a forum like this. Are students who work not just, so we've just gotten another student working on the fish system. We now have 2 graduate students in the lab working on fish, and 2 graduate students in the lab working on dogs, on crickets. But I'd like to actually play I'm specifically looking to recruit students who are interested in electrophysiology in the cricket system. So that's another system that I'm happy to sort of talk about or address when it comes to when it comes to student questions. So I'll pause now and I'll await questions, and you can feel free to ask questions about either system. And I'm happy to also sort of share more about that system if people are interested. You're muted.
Thanks, Dr. Bittu, for this amazing talk. So if you have any questions, you can raise your hands and then unmute yourselves. So we have Harsha who has a question. Harsha, could you unmute yourself? Harsha, you there? Okay, we have Ankush who has a question. Oh yeah, Harsha is here.
Sir, I was watching at the experiment you were screening about the ape.
Yeah.
So I was trying to do it myself from here too.
It's not easy.
Yeah. So what does that prove? So does it prove that apes are smarter, or like does it like why am I not able to do it as fast as?
That's the thing about trying to think of smartness as one thing, right? It clearly isn't.
Yeah, smartness is like it differs, but why am I not able to?
Yeah, I mean, humans aren't good at several things, and this is one of them. Yeah, I mean, remember that evolution is sort of a series of accidents followed by selection. And so there are some things that for which we evidently, don't show any traces of a selection that's at least as strong as selection that you see for equivalent abilities in other animal lineages. And some of the answers always just mutation happened by chance. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we have Ankush who has another question.
Yeah. Hi, Ankush.
Hi. So great talk. I wanted to ask if zebrafish have more potency towards fish that might be of a different gender, and if that is kind of causing some problem, or maybe perhaps if you use a male zebrafish and females in the boxes, would that do something?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's fairly hard for us to tell males and females apart, although, and it's possible that zebrafish also use olfactory cues rather than visual cues. So we don't have a good sense of how much, visually speaking, they distinguish between males and females in shoals. But yes, so far we've not, our control for this is to just have mixed gender shoals, right? To not have male specific and female specific shoals. But one can certainly do that work. It's possible that it's been done, since it's one of those things that seems likely to have already been done. And to my knowledge, shoaling is not a behavior that sort of it does not seem to be something that's, at least the numerical sort of preferences around shoaling don't seem to be gender specific. Yeah.
Thank you.
Soren has a question.
Yeah, so my question is, like the last experiment about the zebrafish, was it also conducted with the foods? So like in one choice we are giving some food, and also along with that we are taking into account the social interactions. So like, I mean, if they go to the less social, I mean, let's say if they go to the 2 fish, so they will be getting more foods, because I mean, less crowding effect. And
you mean this experiment?
Yes.
Okay.
And
This experiment is totally foodless. Okay, so they they just shoal. The food is not involved in the experimental setup at all. They're
Yes,
fed
yes.
just like any other day before they do this, and they do the task, and then they're fed outside the tank. But then there's no food involved here. It's just whom do they want to spend time with or time around, and whom do they want to shoal near. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I'm asking, can it be modified to that? Like,
Yeah, I mean, one can always do that. One can always look at that question. But what specific question are you thinking about? How food influences their social choices?
yes, yes. Like, I mean, if they are going to less crowding place, then they will be get more food, and if they are going
Right,
to
right.
crowded place, so like,
Yeah, it's a good question. So, that also relates to the overall questions around shoaling, right? What are the advantages of shoaling? And certainly, one would think that in the context of food resources, a less crowded place might be more preferable, and in the context of more food resources and lots of predators, you might start to think that being with a larger group might help. So that's sort of that work is being done on just shoaling in general and what the advantages of shoaling would be. And that's also, we think, part of the reason why we don't find fish making very clear selections between these numbers, even though the literature suggests that they do. And we think that it's quite possibly context dependent, and that there may be context specific choices that they make in such a setup.
Okay, so next we have a question by Achantya.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. Yeah, this is a great topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have a couple of questions. So my first question is, could you please like say something about how the animals go to a particular place, and in context of decision making, like how do they decide to which place I should go?
Right. Okay. Did you have another question also, or should I answer this one?
Yeah. So, and I'm talking about if we can give different kind of stimulus which is favorable to them. So I'm giving a visual stimulus versus a smell stimulus.
Mhm.
So I will have some flavor code and some visual cues
Yeah.
in a set of experiment. So what do you think? Like what should they choose to, like in one place they are having the visual cues, and another place in the same experimental setup they are having the so smell cues, order cues. So what they would choose
They choose, yeah.
in context of decision making.
Right. So I will answer the first question first. We know that so this question of where animals go and how those decisions are made varies. I mean, we know that, for example, for bats and mouse and rat models, that there are cells in the hippocampus that sort of encode a memory of specific places. But how decisions are made about where to go seems to be quite specific to the context in which those decisions are made. So, for example, a really, really cool study came out, which we actually presented which my student actually presented in our journal club today, looking at how decision making is made with respect to escape stimuli, right? So the question of whether to go left or right is a question is answered possibly quite differently depending on what exists on the left and the right, right? So are you choosing between food on the left and the right? Are you choosing between different shoals on the left and the right? Are you choosing between is it a choice that involves escaping from a predator? And so this decision-making paper was very cool because it presented an ambiguous choice. So a stimulus that was a looming stimulus, a dark spot growing larger and larger in the eye over time, which in general is similar to the experience of what happens when a predator is moving towards you fast, or really when any object is moving towards you and headed on a collision course with you. This is how it gets represented on the retina. And in such a context, if this is happening from both sides, the question is, where does the fish turn, right? How is the decision made about that? And this is still a preprint, but it was an interesting paper showing activity sort of in a particular part of the fish brain, the isthmus, and while visual sort of perception of these stimuli is processed in the tectum. There seems to be this isthmus below that is active in the making of decisions about where the fish turns. And of course, it's sort of only one leg of that circuit has been worked out, and this is using calcium imaging. So there's a lot more that remains to be done in that system, but a very neat behavioral kind of setup. The second question of what fish do when there are conflicting cues. I mean, good question. This is not something we've tested. It's possibly something other people have tested. The answer might end up being quite specific to what modality you test. So, does something that smells yummy, is that more compelling than something that looks yummy? It might be quite specific to how you do the test. But certainly, how fish deal with conflicting information is an interesting question worth looking at.
Okay, so one more, I think. If there is a food, so you demonstrated apple versus orange, I think.
Yeah.
Apple, orange, and bananas, whatever. But if you are giving two number of apples with left side having a bigger size of apples, like with number 2, and the right side having a smaller size of apples with number 2. So what they would choose in terms of the number learning.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, obviously, before one controls for the size of objects, it's also useful to see what preferences exist around the size of objects. In fact, some of this work's also been done in various contexts. So, there was some work by Anindita Bhadra's lab looking at just sort of this was in dogs, looking at just preferences of dogs for 4 slices of bread versus 1 slice of bread. What happens when it's 4 slices of the same size versus 4 full slices of bread, etc. And the answer is kind of, I mean, perhaps not surprising for people who work on dogs, but just it turns out that the dogs don't care whether it's 4 slices of bread, which are 4 tukras of one bread, or 4 pieces of bread and 4 full pieces of bread versus 1 full piece of bread. Essentially, if it's bread, they don't care. If it's chicken, they care, right? So, this is an example of the kind of thing that's worth explicitly testing, right? Because we, very often a lot of the controls assume that, animals that are making quantitative choices care about, of course, not just the numbers of things, but the quantities of them, the size of the apple in your example. And that may not be the case, right? I think in a lot of cases, we end up with the sort of the animals don't care, right? That ends up often being the paradoxical answer, or at least somewhat disappointing sometimes answer to the questions that we ask.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I see some questions in the chat box as well. Can I answer those?
Yes.
Okay. So Monu said, since we talked about the association of numbers with symbols and understanding of numbers in organisms, what do you think a number is at the most basic level? Like in the context of, say, what does a child think a number is when he's told to associate the sound 1 with 1 finger, and how confident is there? Yeah, I mean, this is a whole set of questions, and developmental psychologists are very interested in questions like this. There's also very interesting work suggesting that how you ask kids to do a task and what kids think you want them to do plays a huge role in how they perform on the task, and then what developmental psychologists think kids are capable of doing. So, for example, the classic sort of Piaget task of taking 5 coins and spreading them out and asking kids, are there more coins now? So at the age of 4, kids say there are more coins. There are no more coins. It's the same number of coins spread out. At the age of 3, kids say that there are more coins. And so for a long time, it was assumed that this idea of kind of spatial invariance of numbers, right, that it's still 5 objects, even if they're spread out and take more space, that the number hasn't changed, that develops between the age of 3 and 4. Then turned out that if you figure out a less verbal way of asking the question, that 2-year-olds are also able to do this task correctly. But at the age of 3, they end up doing it not so correctly. And it turns out that 3 is around the age when children start to develop also various socially contextual identities, such as gender identities and various other identities around who they are relative to everyone else. And social conformity starts to already affect children's mathematical sort of results, because it turns out that when kids are asked at the age of 4, why did you think that there were more when it was spread out, they will verbalize that, well, if it wasn't more, then why did you ask me this question, right? So kids are already sort of one of the things that often gets in in the way of maths and sort of figuring out what might be going on is also trying to provide the right answer, right? And so lots of interesting things suggesting that we have to be careful about how we do these tests about how numerical abilities evolve in kids or develop in kids. But yeah, the question of when it is that kids stop just associating these abstract or these arbitrary kind of symbols and words with the abstract notion of a numerical of quantity is still, I think, unclear, right? But certainly we at some point we get it, and for different kids it clicks at different ages and in different ways perhaps. But yeah, so I don't have a good answer to your question. What do you think a number is at the most basic level? But it's it's an attribute which brains sort of can possibly learn to abstract away from the actual tangible sort of qualities of whatever object is being shown. Like, what object is it? How will it taste? What does it feel like? What color does it look like? Yeah. Okay. Abhishek says, how frequently and under what circumstances do these fishes shoal in the wild? So zebrafish shoal in the wild quite frequently. I think that there's a lot more interesting work to be done on observing wild zebrafish behavior, especially since these are found wild in our country. So there's some work on wild zebrafish in lab settings, but not a lot of just watching wild zebrafish do their thing. So it's a good question, and at least I know there are documented observations of them shoaling in the wild, but not a lot about the behavioral ecology of sort of in the wild. What is behavior of this kind like? Okay. Hi, Abu Bakr Jamal just also posted something about, not a question, but sort of some of these methods of recognizing patterns of increasing complexity and so on. Remind them of sort of games that kids are trained on. Okay, so Akashdeep, you asked, how does the number of parameters in this experiment affect the learning rate? Can you explain what you mean by that? Do you mean the number of attributes that covary with number, such as size, surface area covered, density, that kind of thing? Okay, well, I'll wait for a response. But certainly it affects the learning rate, because the more the number of parameters we have to control for, the more the number of trials we have to put the fish through before we can sort of draw any conclusions about their responses. Okay. Then Monu also asked, are these explanations possible and make sense for chimps being better at sorting? Photographic memory and the order for them is symbolic and not numerical. And for humans, the speed is compromised for more complex thinking and imagination, etc. All of what we can do. Well, certainly chimps seem to have better short-term memory of objects in space. And the order, whether it's symbolic and not numeric, I mean, it's not clear for us that humans would be, I mean, the fact that the order is numeric for us should make the task easier, right? Suppose you were given random symbols and you don't know the order in which they're ranked. In general, my guess is that just in humans alone, they would perform more poorly at a task where they don't have a sense of numeric ordering than if it's just sort of an arbitrary set of symbols. I mean, in some sense, you learn numeracy from associating non-arbitrary kind of sort of ordering with respect to numerical symbols. So, and I'm not sure that one can say that humans are worse because we are doing more complex thinking at the same time, right? I mean, if you had to do this task, it's not like at that time you're like, I will now compose a symphony, or I will, do great human things. Humans who concentrate on this task are still not as good as chimps. So I think you just have to, and this is just one of many examples. It's just a fun example to show, because you can try and do the task while you're actually watching this video, and you can watch yourself fail compared to the chimps. But there are several tasks at which chimps and various animals are better than humans, and it's not a surprise at all. Okay. So Akashdeep said, like, the logarithmic relation of decision making and the number of choices. Yes, much of this work is just binary choices, right? It's not ternary choices. In this experiment that I've shown you, the one where fish make a choice between two shoal sizes, we have actually tried to look at binary choices versus 3 choices. But our goal was not to look at how complex decision making changes decisions so much as just looking at whether the choice between 2 and 4 changes when you introduce a third variable, right? Does that affect how choices are made? So yes, one would guess that that an increased number of choices would make decision making harder, and work in humans already suggests that humans find decision making sort of relatively stressful when they have to choose between 7 or more objects. So 7 this is work by Sheena Iyengar, I think. Good stuff showing that humans also find comparisons between more than 7 objects sort of stressful and difficult. So certainly one could guess that with a larger number of binary comparisons to make, the computation time goes up. So Vivek, good question. The dog experiment, maybe the dog had done this with the sense of smell rather than its sense of vision. This was something that I was actually thinking of saying earlier when, the question was asked about whether, I think Achintya had asked this question about whether, what happens if the attributes are different. One is smell, one is vision. We spend most of our time trying to control for smell, right? That's a large fraction of the time that we spend in the lab is just trying to make sure that the animals aren't smelling their way to the answer. And in fact, this is one of the problems with some of the other experiments that have been done in this field. They don't control for smell. So in our case, as you can see in the fish experiment, the fish is in a completely separate tank from the choice fish. So the shoal sizes that they choose to shoal with are not made on which part of the tank smells fishier, but it's a purely visual choice. They don't get any smell information. And in the dog experiment, even though we initially train them to go in one direction or another based on putting food in front of these, when we actually, after they get used to the setup, they have to make the choice, and only then do they get rewarded. So the food is not placed there, causing the 2 sort of vala area to smell yummier than the 1 vala area. By the time by the time they're doing the experiment, so there are initial training sessions where you just get them used to the fact that 2 ke samne there's 2 pieces of food and 1 ke samne there's 1 piece of food. But then we move them to the testing phase where there's no smelly object anywhere in the room. So except their own bodies, I guess. But no sort of food smells sort of associated with either. So you're right that that's an important thing that we have to control for, and we do. Okay. Yeah, Monu, it's a tough one to answer. The question: what is color? What is number? These representations of these abstract ideas in the brain, and how they relate to perception are difficult. Can we perform experiments on humans as well? Yes, obviously not manipulative, unethical experiments, but within the framework of testing sort of numerical cognition, perhaps we can, and certainly some people do in trying to understand how math is done with humans. Okay. All right, so Adishakti said all of these are largely observations of experiments. What are the reasons behind them? Neuronal pathways or parts of the brain involved, with humans and mathematics. So as I showed you, we have the only sense we have of neuronal pathways involved comes from fMRI. And that tells you which area of the brain is doing a computation, but not necessarily how circuitry abstracts numerical kind of information from whatever sensory input they're getting. So that's the limit when it comes to trying to look at these questions in humans. But it's precisely because we don't know a lot about the neuronal pathways involved that we're starting this work in zebrafish, because zebrafish lend themselves to answering these questions particularly well. So as you know, you can, I wonder if I have calcium indicator. no, I don't have a calcium indicator slide in here. Maybe I should. I can sort of show you another example of what calcium imaging can do. But the idea essentially is that you're watching a fish brain, and these zebrafish, at least at the larval stage, have transparent brains or transparent sort of skulls and skin, so you can actually just watch the brain while the fish is making numerical choices. And we're hoping that might eventually give us a sense of what neuronal pathways might be involved. In case of shoals, the fish may have sensed the higher temperature side. Yes, absolutely. So smell, temperature, of course they're cold-blooded, but so it's not the same as having like 4 warm mammals on one side of a room versus 2 on the other side of the room. But certainly heat, smell, all of these things need to be controlled for. And that's why in our fish experiment, you can see that the fish is completely isolated from the shoals. There's no temperature contiguity. There's no water contiguity. There's just no other attribute besides visual attributes that they can get in terms of information. Were these fish, Ankush asked a good question, were these fish looking at shoal sizes isolated before the experiment? They were. This is very important. But they were isolated for about 20 minutes. We're starting to wonder whether they should be isolated for longer. But yeah, it's an important question, something that we worry about in the lab. Okay, in the case of chimps, how do we know that the association is numerical and not symbolic just for the ordering experiment? We don't, Monu, we have no idea whether it's numerical. In fact, in the absence of confirmation that it's numerical, we don't claim that it's numerical, right? It could just be symbolic ordering. That said, chimps are in independent experiments known to be able to compare, they're shown to be able to make choices between the number of objects. So again, 2 apples versus 3. In fact, chimps seem to actually be able to do fractional adding as well. So if you give chimps like 3 apple cores, which are 2/3, of which like 1/3 has been carved out, and you give them a choice between choosing 3 of those versus 4, which are 1/5 carved out, right? Maybe not quite such complicated things, but they're certainly able to do sort of 2x3 versus 1x3 type, comparisons. So they do have some. We know that they have some numerical skills from those experiments, but it doesn't tell us whether, when they're doing the experiment that I showed you, that they are numerically ordering them. It absolutely tells us nothing about that.
Let's have one last question from Anushka.
Yeah.
So, hello, Dr. Rajaraman. I'm Anushka.
Hi.
Hi, I was having a question for you. Yeah. I understand how the basic reward system works. See, if you want an animal to choose between 2 numbers, you reward it when it chooses a desired number. But how are animals exactly trained for an elaborative process? For instance, when they are to arrange something in an increasing order. So like, do you reward them when they get everything right? Or does it consist of small rewards leading to the bigger thing?
Yeah, good question. This is a good question to ask, actually, Tetsuro Matsuzawa. Much of the work on chimpanzees has always involved a human, like, in very close proximity to the chimp, teaching, training, breaking the complex task into simpler tasks, and so on. As I said, Matsuzawa's model is interesting because it's a very different model. It doesn't involve like the researcher going into work every day and making the chimp work every day and sort of working together very closely on training the chimp. It involves leaving the chimps alone, and they can wander around. But then if the chimps want those yummy little bits of apple, which they do care about, unlike zebrafish aren't very food motivated, but thankfully chimps like apples. Monkeys also seem to be better trained when they are thirsty and want water rather than when they want food. So these things vary a lot from animal to animal as to what motivates them. But in the case of Matsuzawa's chimps, it's not as if they're going to have to work to get some water. It's more that there's an optional reward if they want it. They go into this sort of training paradigm, and then it's like a video game, right? They sort of mess around until they get the right sequence. And it's possible that they started off with sort of sequences of 2 numbers, right? So learning the ordering between pairs of numbers, and then later on between larger sequences. So I'm not familiar with what training protocol they use, but that's in general, we find that that's what one has to do to ramp up task complexity. But it's possible that that we may not have to sort of do that, and that animals are fairly good at learning patterns, but there needs to be some demonstration of what pattern needs to be picked for a reward. Yeah.
So if that's all.
Okay, and if any of you are interested in working not on this system but on the other system, especially if any of you are interested in sort of in doing single neuron recordings from crickets and bush crickets, then please just get in touch. You can do this. I mean, we're looking for PhD students who'll do this. If you're looking to do a PhD here, we're looking for students who want to do this at a finally a master's project level. Anything that you would like.
So with that, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Bittu, for enthralling us with your dynamic oration, and I'd like to thank everyone else for joining in.
All right, thank you very much.
So I'll end the meeting now.